DevRelcon deep dives. Yar.
Yeah, well, thank you all for joining. I think this is a topic on which each of you has a point of view, because you work for companies who are either looking to tackle this through a product, or your product itself is perhaps one that faces this kind of issue. So, what are the risks that your organization faces when a developer signs up for the first time? So, Kelly, would you maybe mind taking us through how that applies to your company?
Yeah, so Twilio does a lot of things now. We have communications APIs, customer engagement APIs, but I think one of the things that this applies the most to is the way that we work with telephony companies. And so Twilio works with global telephony providers all around the world. And so we have to basically have agreements under the hood of the Twilio APIs with these telephony providers saying, our APIs are going to not be abused, and we're not going to be abusing the services that you provide for us. And so I think one of the things that we risk when we have this kind of self-service onboarding is making it so that one of our providers shuts off access that may impact customers that aren't abusing our APIs. And so I think some of the risks that you get with these types of things, it's always money, right? Like people are going to be looking at spending more money than they want to, or fraudsters taking advantage of different accounts. But I think there's kind of the customer trust risk that you have there too, whether or not that's a customer that is doing the fraud knowingly, or somebody that has their credentials taken advantage of, that then ends up impacting other customers because of the fraud that was happening there. So I think that's one of the ways that it impacts our services.
Thank you. Christina, I'd love to hear from you as well, what it's like.
Yeah, so great answer. I totally appreciate that perspective, because I will say I'm probably another layer down, right? Because we have merchants, consumers, and developers. So we have, from an API perspective, the challenges that are faced with not only our developers, but the impacts that come from a merchant and consumer perspective that ultimately land with the developers. So we ultimately, I think for me, I'm really passionate about ensuring that the developer's experience from an onboarding perspective is seamless. And when we talk about the layers, I have to think of the experience between the developers and the merchants. So what does that experience look like between the two of them as an operation model, and ensuring that we are consistently thinking about that developer experience to ensure that we're not creating friction with the self-serving onboarding that we're trying to enable. And I will say that I'm of sound mind of myself. Like, I've done a ton of research to know that in our space, developers are very influential to merchants, and ultimately they are the ones who are deciding. So I don't think, in my opinion, we in our space can even think of not creating a self-serving onboarding experience, because of the fact that developers want to test it. They want to play with it. They want to see if it works and fits the use case. And in order for them to be able to influence or even suggest a solution to a merchant, they've got to be able to try it.
So, Sean, you were at Google for quite some time, and with a huge range of product offerings there and different channels that they're sold through. You must have seen all sorts of different forms of risk.
Yeah, so I actually worked in a space not too different than Twilio. So I worked on business communication products there, and actually Twilio is like one of the developer partners that we worked with very closely. So we kind of had a similar level of risk, I guess, where we worked on a product that was not SMS, but was RCS business messaging, which is essentially the evolution of SMS. And we provided APIs that people could create, rich chatbot experiences over this channel. And certainly, initially we actually steered away from self-serve when we first launched the product because of the sort of the challenges that come along with that in terms of managing, fraud and abuse and so forth. But over time, as we got better at sort of handling those and we understood the market better, we introduced self-serve onboarding. But even with that, there's always risk that someone's going to take advantage of the system in some way, or even not necessarily take advantage in the terms of like, I'm signing up and I'm purposely trying to abuse it, but actually using it in a way that they think is effective for their business that actually feels like spammy or something like that, I think is a risk that is not talked about as much. And it's a little bit of like a gray area when it comes to these types of platforms where it's like, hey, like every company wants to do marketing, every company wants to do sales. And there's like you kind of are constantly towing the line between like persistence and annoyance with those types of things, that type of messaging. And when you have platforms like email, Twilio, the products I worked on at Google, you can cross that line without necessarily intentionally doing that, because you're seeing maybe ROI delivered to your business, but you might actually be annoying a huge amount of people in the process.
Thank you. Yeah. I'd love to follow up with another question, if I may. And the question is, why are developer targeted products more at risk than those aimed at other groups?
I'm happy to start.
Please. Thank you.
So I think a lot of it has to do with the problem space. So if you think about in the physical world, there's always a risk for abuse and for fraud and these types of things, but it's at a much more local level. Like if I go to a bar in my local neighborhood and they want to ask me, I have to prove my age, I show my ID. In theory, that person could see that ID, memorize it. Maybe they memorize every ID that they see that day. And there's some level of risk that they could use that information to do some sort of harm. But that's much different than me posting a picture of my driver's license on Twitter or it being exposed during like a data breach. So there's like a difference in terms of we have like locality essentially in the physical world, whereas the digital world, and in particular for developer products where you can programmatically do things at scale, suddenly you're talking about like global impact of something that maybe outside of the digital world is like fairly small, fairly low risk. Even if something happens, it's not going to be too bad in comparison to being able to exploit like millions or even billions of people.
Yeah, I definitely think it's a scale problem, right? Because you can test these things really easily and see if you can get away with fraud and abuse at a scale that might be really profitable to somebody that's trying to take advantage of that.
And so then there's the scale, which is, the great thing about everything. It's the good thing as well as the bad thing for creating software. But I guess as well, maybe is it easier to hide what you're doing sometimes? So without getting into creating a handbook to developer API fraud, I'd love to know some of the techniques that people use, because I think the reason that I was interested in this topic is that, as I said in introduction, particularly in the payments and open banking space, there was a time in Europe when to use an open banking API, you had to have approval from the national regulator for banking. And that meant putting down huge amounts of deposit money and so on. Whereas now it's been a little bit more relaxed. But that balance between fraud and openness is having a real impact on both vendor and potential customer business opportunities. So, what are the sorts of things that people are doing that are making this such a problem?
So I think there's a couple things. I think one is like a psychological thing where in a lot of ways it's much easier to fraud someone in your home at your computer, where you don't have to actually see what the impact of what you're doing. All you see is maybe the positive impact of that, of like, oh, well, I'm like, making money or something like that. It's much harder to do that, I think, in person as like a grifter that's manipulating people in person. That's a much feels much more like diabolical in some ways, like from a psychological standpoint. So I think there's like a disconnect that happens in the digital world that allows you to kind of feel like you have a little bit more freedom to take advantage of these types of systems. But I also think that even though there are these challenges, there's also I think we also have a lot of facilities to it now available where I think in some ways we're getting better at like detecting some of this stuff. There are companies like Sif Science that use AI to try to determine patterns of behavior of people who are causing fraud in systems. I'm sure PayPal has all kinds of things going on there in terms of machine learning. And I don't know like if you can name a single company that turned off self-serve because they couldn't manage the sort of cost benefit ratio that you're taking on with self-serve. So if that's like your sort of way you need to go to market because your go to market is targeting developers that can put in like a credit card and pay on a monthly basis, then it's kind of hard to scale to the long tail without having self-serve.
Yeah, but I don't think I've seen companies who are saying the risk is too great and so we're going to switch it off. What I have seen are discussions in companies where it will be used as an excuse, not by people who favor a top-down business model. They'll say, well, in our industry, it's too risky just to let anyone sign up. So we have to do the deals on the golf course or over expensive sushi, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So,
I mean, I think that's something that we see a lot is like, there's like, you have to sign up to use our service, right? So we have some like lead generation in that sense, but like we never know if we don't always know if somebody's signing up to use us at a hackathon or if they're signing up to use us at a company where they're potentially looking at spending, thousands and thousands of dollars. And so I think what you're touching on, right, is like this idea that one of the arguments against self-service is that you have that lead generation, that sales driven, that top down approach. And I think that's one of the things that I think of as my responsibility is to fight back against that mindset of like, the reason not to do self-service is because, we're going to frame it in this conversation of risk, but we really want this because we're used to having the sales touch point. We're used to like being able to understand the use case so that we can like handhold them through how to implement this and make sure that they're, maybe we're making sure that they're not doing anything nefarious. But I think that's our responsibility as developer relations professionals in order to build the guardrails as much as we can to prevent that type of behavior from developers, like you mentioned, like doing stuff that maybe isn't necessarily nefarious, but is going to make something that is abusive or spammy. It's up to us to have the documentation in place to tell people the best practices on how to do things and design the APIs in a way that, guides them to do that and makes it harder for them to make those mistakes. And I think that's something that like I have conversations about, with some of the APIs that we have is there's certain APIs that we have that are completely self-service. And then there's some like, if you want a short code with Twilio, you have to go through some additional approval processes. And I think there's different reasons for that like we explain to the developers, and some of that makes sense to people. And so I think one of the things that we're thinking a lot about is like, what are the things that need to be self-service and what like where on the scale can you basically explain why it's not, and is that something that you can gain the developer's trust, provide a sandbox, whatever it needs to be in order to make that experience as seamless as possible without frustrating someone.
Yeah, I think, go ahead, Christina.
I was just going to say, so from my perspective, and I have a question on the back end of this, but from my perspective, I would say that I am aligned with all of them. It's definitely challenging with regards to our experience with getting into the ecosystem and doing the things. I'll say from a product perspective, because a lot of the times what I'm doing is listening and learning from the developer ecosystem, where I sit in the world. I'll say that I feel truly that developers are misunderstood from the business. And I say that because I don't know why. Maybe it's a human thing, but people are very scared of technology, like the underlying like technology. So like they don't want to have those conversations, and that's why I sit with the people I sit. I love having technical conversations with developers, and I also like being able to provide an opportunity to voice technology and not be afraid of creating a sandbox. And so my question was actually going to be like, how much is self-service being impacted because organizations aren't creating or simulating like use cases or simulating things instead of saying, here's everything, here's the entire API, do it yourself, backwards, figure out our business rules, figure out like how much of that is impacted because we're not simulating the experience versus like expecting. I don't think developers don't expect us to give them every single piece of detail, but they expect to understand how it works. They expect to understand like and be able to see it. So I just wonder how much simulation of an experience isn't being prioritized, and that's what would create a inability to self-serve onboard.
Well, I think with
Question.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I've been having conversations more and more about like the value of like that simulation, the sandbox environment, right? And I think that you see this with companies like Stripe, do this where they provide, everybody loves the credit card number 424242, et cetera, because it's a real API experience, but like with something like that, you're not actually charging something. And I think that is something that you can think about like with other APIs that might have this kind of risk, is like, how can you create that sandbox experience? Or one of the things that we've been using is this idea of progressive trust. And so if you have, like, when you onboard with Twilio, in a trial account, you can only send SMSs to a verified number, and that's usually your personal number. And so that's, one example of like, you're onboarding with us, you can't immediately send 10 million text messages like with a trial account. And so, but once, you give us a credit card, that's one way that we're like, okay, maybe you're serious about this. Maybe you give us a business address, you're more serious about this. We have a way to contact you if something goes wrong. Again, whether it's nefarious or not, that idea of like, you build up some trust with the business and then we kind of unlock the doors from there. But I think to your point, it's very important that we have that kind of like simulation and that sandbox environment for people to get started, whether or not that is like granting them, or because they, like you said, they don't want the entire keys to the kingdom right out of the gate. They want to also be kind of shown what to do and how to onboard with your API in a way that makes sense progressively.
Yeah, we did. I worked on something similar to that, where we on one of the products I worked on at Google called Business Messages, where we had like a progressive for a certain type of partner. So you could register, you could kind of get into a sandbox environment, all self-serve, but then to actually launch the experience on like Google search, there was a more lengthy vetting process to do that, because that's something that's like could be really bad for consumers if it was the wrong type of thing that was being launched. And impersonation would be like the biggest risk there, where I pretend to be Walmart or something. And then, but for certain people doing that at very high scale, we would create, they would have a more in-depth process to vet that partner essentially. And then they would be able to launch at scale, but it was a progressive launch, start with 10, then 100, 1,000 or something like that. And you kind of like build trust. But I was thinking about this. I think one of the challenges that companies have, especially with the growth in like sort of the, the API economy, like developer first products, is I think what ends up happening is a lot of companies like rush into self-serve without thinking through necessarily the potential implications for their business. So then it's like an afterthought when these types of like abuse scenarios maybe happen. Like I think the holy grail for any product is like, you have self-serve, people sign up, they put the credit card in. I never need to like touch anything. I don't have like a big sales force that I have to run. Like it's just, I'm, making money hand over fist and just like, developing the product. Like that's great. But I think there's to make that flywheel, to get to that point where you have that flywheel and everything's smooth, there's a lot of thought that goes into, I think, the companies that have done this really well at scale, that they're thinking ahead of time of like, do we need that sandbox environment? Do we need this kind of progressive building of trust? And I think there's a lot of people or a lot of companies that end up like rushing into maybe self-serve because they want to get to that holy grail experience without kind of thinking through the impact of that. And then the other thing too is there's like a balance of power that happens, I think, between products and self-serve. And the companies that have sort of the most power in the relationship. So if you take, for example, a company like Apple, when they first launched onto iOS, it was quite a process to build an iOS app and get that approved into the market, but people were willing to put up with it because all of that friction, because of what that would give them. And similar with Apple Business Chat today, it takes quite a bit of effort to get approved onto Apple Business Chat, but people are willing to do that because then it opens you up to this massive market of people who are on iOS devices. So Apple sort of holds the power there, and people are willing to put up with a less than optimal experience. Now, if you're a startup that's just starting out and no one like cares what you do, then you need to significantly lower the barrier of friction to get started. So then I think that's when you can potentially run into these problems where you're like, you need to shortcut the sign-up process as much as possible because you're trying to get eyeballs, you're trying to get people to use your product. But then if you're successful, you end up, I think, running into these abuse scenarios where maybe you weren't ready for self-serve, if that makes sense.
I really like that discussion of like how companies hold power with like developers and these types of things. And I hadn't really thought of it that way, but I think that kind of ties back to the example of like, if you're going to buy a short code with Twilio, like you're pretty serious about using the product. And the reason that you would do that is because you want to send a lot of messages at scale, right? And if you're at that point, you've already tested out the product, you're willing to spend a little bit more effort because you understand what that's going to get you. But I think for a lot of these companies, like if you're a developer signing up for PayPal and you just want to like test out the product, I'm assuming that like you want to make sure that that experience is useful for people in a way that gets them started, gets them successful, gets them to that aha moment before, they have to go through and talk to somebody in sales.
Yeah, we definitely see like just what I've heard in the community, they want to test the things. And it's interesting because the complexity that comes from the payment space, like I'm developing a solution for a merchant who wants to do payments every 2 weeks, and they want to be able to do this, that, the other. So to describe that in a way and then simulate that so that they understand how it works and how to recreate that, I think is probably the complexity that comes with that, and why it's so important, I believe, to simulate, because there's so many different use cases for payments. I mean, do you want iOS? Do you have an app? Do you have it in the web browser? Do you have it? I mean, there's so many use cases that it definitely becomes overwhelming. And as a developer who's just trying to understand how to solve my problem, where do I start? I don't even know.
So then, what would the practical advice be to people who are responsible for that onboarding flow right now, and they face their desire is to create something that's as friction-free as possible, but they have another team in the company who quite rightly is saying, well, we got to balance that with all these risks that we see. So how do you argue your corner for friction-free onboarding without seeming really naive, I guess?
I think that this was touched on a little bit already, but there's APIs for this, right? Like, and you might have to go through some. I think it's funny because you as a company like can use an API like Ziff Science, and this is actually like what I work on at Twilio is all of our account security APIs. And it's funny because that started out a lot with like two-factor authentication, phone verification, these things that introduce some friction. People are more or less used to now, but it takes time, and there's a funnel for all of that. But one of the things that we're focusing on more is this frictionless stuff, this background authentication, trying to get information about people and about accounts that sign up that don't take any time and don't take anything away from the self-service experience. And I think one of the things that we think about a lot is this idea of like risk profiles, step up authentication. You can use these background signals, for determining how risky someone is. And then if you run into a scenario, either by identifying someone through an API, like SIFT, like some of the stuff that Twilio offers, you can determine, is this something that we want to run then more authentication and introduce this friction on? Or is this something where we're going to only unlock a certain set of features for these people if they're a riskier profile until we do additional vetting. And so I think one of the first places to start is like figure out how much that you can do without adding the friction. Because I think there is a lot of opportunities out there to, email risk profiles, phone number risk profiles, bot detection. There's lots of APIs out there that you can build into your onboarding flow. And I think most people are already doing this at this point. But I think thinking of that as not just like a silver bullet, but also as that maybe this is a way that we can divide up people into different risk profiles. And then if you're a riskier account, then take them down that more frictionful path.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think a lot of it, I think you need to also like assess like what are the goals that you're trying to accomplish. Like does like frictionless sounds great, but does that necessarily is that going to lead to like moving the needle for your business? Ultimately, it depends on, I think, like where you are as a company, what kind of customers you're targeting. Like if you're really targeting customers that are signing multi-year contracts, then that might not make sense for your business. And maybe someday you do self-serve, but it's it depends on like what stage your company is and what your resources are and where you want to focus your attention. And then I think the other thing too is like if you think like, okay, well, we really need to do self-serve onboarding, we want to reduce friction as much as possible, that's going to lead us to success, then you want to understand the risks. So if there are people in your company that have this hesitation, or they understand, okay, well, this could happen or this could happen, you need to kind of work through those risk scenarios and figure out like how do you balance the essentially balance risk with friction in a way that's going to be successful. And there's there's different techniques you can use. Like there's people are probably familiar with the idea of like running a postmortem, where you can run like a premortem, essentially, where you look at your system and you go through at each stage and you're like, if someone gets to hear, what is the worst case scenario? And then how do we protect against that? So you need to kind of, like I was saying earlier, like this stuff can't be an afterthought. It's something that has to be kind of baked into the design process from the beginning.
I want to piggyback on both because I loved absolutely both of those answers. I also think outside in thinking, I think that the phases that a developer is in your ecosystem is extremely important to think about. I think we oftentimes, so we're talking onboarding, but what about when they come back and then they get that two-factor authentication, or if they're in the middle of development and then they have to validate? Like it's in my mind, the end-to-end experience, including onboarding and then so on. And if we don't consider the phases of the developer's life cycle within that experience, we're going to always create friction. And I mean, I definitely think that there's that. I'm going to talk product owner. As a product owner, the stakeholder management and ensuring that as a product owner, I'm bringing that developer's voice back to those that are determining that model of risk and what that experience looks like, and ensuring that we're not creating a friction environment. I will say that I think, generally speaking, at least my goal is to keep someone in the ecosystem, right? And I think that what we don't necessarily think of is, because there's so many APIs, because there's so many different solutions and so many corporations and organizations, it's very easy to drop a company and move on. Like it's extremely easy. So From a developer's perspective, I take their voice into consideration, manage the stakeholders, and ensure that I'm thinking from the outside in, not from the inside out.
Yeah. Yeah, I think like going back to, I think like you sort of building on what you were saying and going back to one of the things I mentioned about goals, like if your goal with self-serve is you want to give people a chance to play with the product because you think that that's how the best way for them to understand how your product can like be a solution for them, then I think there's ways of crafting a solution to solve that problem that don't necessarily give them sort of the keys of the kingdom, like Kelly was saying that you can sign up on Twilio, you can send messages to certain phone numbers and things like that, but it's not like you get a short code and you're starting to send messages, text messages from like the short code of Walmart or Target or something like that immediately. There's a lot more involved to get to that stage, so I think if your goal
Just
is
to
really
be clear, we
to
do not allow that.
So if your goal is really like, I want people to be able to play with the system so that I can convince them that this is like a good product that's going to solve their problems, like there's lots of ways of doing that without them having a need to go to like live production where you kind of bring on all this risk into your system.
I think this is actually another interesting point about like one of the things that people are sometimes worried about too, is that like you can like write an infinite loop with some of these APIs and all of a sudden, oops, like you're talking to support about the large bill that you ran up. And so sometimes like limiting the amount that somebody can do up front is beneficial too, because then they're not as afraid of like, oh crap, I don't really know what I'm doing with this API. Like there's benefits of like scoping the self-serve opportunities from like a billing perspective and making sure that people are, discovering and playing around with the API responsibly.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think another thing too that companies don't necessarily think about sometimes when building self-serve onboarding is the risk that actually brings to their company, not just for abuse and fraud, but for a bad developer experience. Like you can create something where someone could sign up, but if you don't have the documentation that's available, or SDKs, or like all these other components and assets that someone needs in order to be successful with the product, you might actually be kind of like shooting yourself in the foot, where it might be better to kind of like walk people through the process to start with, so that like here's like the friction points is where people are getting stuck, rather than just kind of like opening up the gates from day one. Like you have to really think about, I think, the more holistic picture and all the things that go into making like a really successful developer experience, if that's the path that you want to go down. And that takes a while to kind of get there, I think.
So then in effect, the friction that you introduce through progressive permissions, actually you can tie it into teaching someone the platform or the API.
Right, yeah. I think of it like it's like a video game. You don't start out a video game on level 1, well, maybe in the 1980s, but nowadays the way video games are built, you start out pretty modest. You can jump, maybe you can punch somebody or something like that, and then 16 hours later, level 23, you're strafing and you got all kinds of weapons, and you look like some sort of cyborg using the game controller. But it takes all this stuff to build up to that skill set. And I think it's similar with developer products. Like you don't want to just be like, here's like all the APIs and go nuts. Like people don't learn that way. It's more of a progressive learning. So it takes a lot of thought, I think, to work through what it is that people need up front, and then kind of like building on that. And that takes time, like working more directly with developers, understanding what the experience is like, where the friction points are, what are the types of things that they need. And it's hard to kind of build that in a vacuum. You really, just like any product, it kind of is going to fail the first time it encounters real users. So you need to I think, not necessarily rush into that. Start with hand-holding, make sure people be successful. And then when you get to a stage where you feel like that you can build all that stuff that people can be successful on their own, then you can kind of open that up and give it a try.
I love that. Thank you. One question I'd love to ask, and maybe this is more of an open-ended question. I'd love to hear from the three of you. If I wanted to start building a self-service program for my developer tool, what are some what are some pieces of advice, some scars perhaps that you'd love to warn me about?
I can go first.
Thank you.
I think, one of the things that I try to keep top of mind is that a developer in the ecosystem is a customer in one way or another, whatever customer is defined to you, right? So a developer in the ecosystem is a customer. And in order for the developer to have a good experience, you not only have to think about the happy path, but what about the unhappy path? How is that developer going to get support? How is that developer going to be monitored or engaged in the ecosystem of the support systems? Are they going to have, the ability to know that on the other side of technical support, or whoever the support team is, they're going to be able to know what APIs they're using, what API calls they did, how many times they got a 400, 500, 200, how they're going to get through that with the support. So I think for me, it's in that onboarding, not only are you thinking of the developer's experience and how successful they're going to be, but you also have to think of the business and the operations and how you're going to like create a frictionless environment between the two of them.
I spend most of my time thinking like one step before that. And I really appreciate that perspective, because I feel like what I think a lot about is getting people to that like aha moment as fast as possible. And so somebody comes into Twilio and they say like, hey, I want to send a 2-factor and like check a 2-factor authentication, one-time passcode. I want to get them doing that as quickly as possible. And so my goal with the types of functions that I do, the blog posts I write, like the code samples I provide, is to make sure that they're equipped to get up and running, have the token sent, be able to check the token. Again, like that aha moment is a really satisfying experience for a developer, no matter what API you're using. And there's certain things at Twilio that we do that well, and there's certain products that we're not great at doing that. And I think that's sometimes due to API design, sometimes that's due to the documentation, sometimes that's due to just the general product complexity. I think sometimes you can't avoid like that taking a little bit longer if it's something that like you have to embed a mobile SDK into your application. That's not necessarily something that's going to happen in 5 minutes. But I think like one of the things I advocate a lot is that like very first getting started experience, and trying to make that a successful and satisfying experience for the developer in as little amount of time as possible. And there's tons of things that I'm skipping over because of that. But I think I'm lucky that we're, a big enough company now that we have lots of people coming at this from different angles so I can advocate for that kind of getting started experience, while somebody else is pushing back on like how do we capture that like support experience after? And I think you do need these different perspectives in the room.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think a little bit that happens before you can get to that stage too, is that you need to understand even your use cases. So, the fact that like, Twilio's been around long enough, they understand probably a lot of types of use cases for different verticals. So you can kind of optimize down that path. But if you're like an earlier stage company and you have an API that you're bringing to market, you might not actually understand all the types of use cases or the things that people want to accomplish with it. So I think before you can kind of try to optimize down a path, you need to start by like actually talking to people who are using your API. And that's probably something you should, continually do throughout your company's life. But I think my like number one advice would be just like figure out how to talk to people and figure out what it is they're trying to accomplish and what hurdles they're running into. And then from there, you can start to build, prototype things, minimal viable products. And it's really this cycle of like design, test, iterate, get feedback, iterate. And you just kind of keep doing that. And the shorter you can make that cycle and the faster you can spin that flywheel of learning, then I think that's like how you end up creating like a great product. And then additionally, when it comes to developer experience, I think like one of the missteps that companies sometimes make is they don't think of like the product experience, the APIs, the docs, the SDKs as kind of one unified product, you end up with a situation where each of those things are owned by different parts of a company. And if you can see the org chart in the representation of those assets, where the docs looks like a completely different thing than the API reference in the SDK and the product. And the companies that do the best job in the world, I think, with creating a great developer experience, especially when it comes to like self-serve onboarding, all those things kind of like work very nicely together. They're all kind of building off each other. You go to the SDK and maybe that leads you into the product, and the product can lead you into the docs, and they kind of all like sing together in some way. And I always think about it as like, you want to create like a Disneyland ride where people are having this like great experience, but they like, if you're in a Disneyland ride, you're not getting off the ride to go like explore. You're kind of directed down this path where the things are there to like entertain you and create this great experience, but you're being fed that thing. And a lot of thought has gone into what goes into that, feeding process in terms of entertainment. I think a lot of thought has to go into the feeding process for like a great developer experience too.
Thank you. These are fantastic points. Thank you. Could it then be argued that given that this developer experience and this race to the aha moment, this sort of like unified product has such an importance, could it be argued that the sort of, let's call it, development of this self-service onboarding experience could not be an afterthought, but rather part of the development of a product itself?
Yeah, I would agree with
Definitely.
that if that makes sense for your plans for go-to-market. If that's aligned with how you want to take the product to market, then you need to be thinking about that probably from the onset of developing the product.
And I think Christina mentioned this earlier, that like, even if you are in a sales-led motion, and this is something that like as Twilio has grown, we started out mostly as a self-service company, but now, we have a much larger sales team than we did 12 years ago. But still, like, developers are in the rooms when these decisions are being made, and they're often the ones that are advocating for the solutions that, even if they're not the ones with the company credit card, they're the ones that are influencing those decisions. And so having at least a playground or a sandbox or something where they can try it out and understand like what they're going to be working with can be really invaluable to even a top-down motion as well. Yeah,
I'm going to second all of them. I mean, I totally agree. No, I'm with everybody else. I have nothing else to add value.
Thank you.
Well, look, folks, I think it's clear that the answer to the question posed in the roundtable title is no. So I think we've solved that. That's great. But I mean, more seriously, I guess my main takeaway from this conversation is that it's the duty of people designing developer experiences to balance that risk with the need for developer autonomy. And so developer autonomy doesn't have to be a free-for-all where you're just thrown into a situation with no guide rails, but rather it's a case of the risk of fraud, the risk of non-intentional but nonetheless bad behavior is just one of the many things you have to balance in designing the developer experience. And self-service is still possible for all sorts of different products if that's your go-to-market, but it's not just fraud and risk that you have to think about. It's really a whole palette of different concerns.
Yeah, I think people discount how much work goes into creating a great self-service onboarding experience, and they think like, okay, well, of course we want that, and we'll, you create it. It's just like they discount maybe the impact that might have from like a fraud and abuse standpoint as well. So I just think like anybody who's thinking along these lines to kind of slow down and think deeply about what it means for your business. Would turning on self-service right now be a bad idea? Like, would that actually hurt your brand because you don't have all these other components that go into it, and it would actually end up like leading to a worse experience for customers? Whereas especially if you're early, like it's really valuable to have people in those conversations with customers. And I understand you want there's like maybe pressure to turn on the onboarding so you can really scale, but you might not be ready for that scale yet. And then the other thing is just like, if you're going to go down that path, it's really like a big product decision that you need to be thinking deeply about, not just like the risk and abuse scenarios, but kind of like all those components that go into it.
I'm gonna lead with I will second Sean, and I always go around saying just because we can doesn't mean we should. So, I just because we can doesn't mean we should. So to Sean's point, I think, thinking of that experience end to end and all the things that we've brought up today, I think is extremely important. And just because you can or you think you should doesn't mean you should. I mean, you need to make sure that the experience is optimized.
Great. Well, Kelly, Sean, Christina, thank you very much for joining us today. I would just like to ask, where can people find out more about what each of you are doing, or where can they find you on the internet?
I am on Twitter at Kelly Robinson.
I'm also at Twitter at dev_Christina.
I'm also on Twitter at Sean Faulkner, and then you can also find me at our company's website, skyflow.com. So you can learn more about what I do for my day job. Yeah.
DevRel Con Deep Dives. Yar!